Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. An absolute pleasure to speak to you both. How are you doing?
Very good.
Thank you,
Hi,
Sarah.
Nice that you're both in the same place. Normally we've got multiple Zoom screens going on, so that seems like a luxury.
We've done a fair few of those over last few months. So yeah, it's nice to be together in the room.
It's true.
So maybe we could just kick off with a brief introduction to the real Charlie Chaplin. I mean, there are just, probably so many books out there, so many films, so many exhibitions, you name it, covering, the life and work of this man. But this is quite a unique documentary. So give us a brief intro to it.
Yeah, well, thank you. As you say, there's been hundreds of books written about Chaplin, countless documentaries. It's a life that's been gone over so many times. And it's a life that even during his lifetime, I think people were trying to make sense of. I think someone said about 100 years ago, there's more Chaplin rumors, myths, legends, and beliefs than many a system of religion. He's someone who, even today, I think people across the world still recognize by a very simple outline, that when we see that hat, cane, and the boots and the moustache, I think that image is kind of imprinted somehow on like cultural memory. But from the moment he first stepped onto the cinema screen over a century ago, I think people have been trying to work out how the figure on the screen, how that kind of corresponds with the man who wore the costume, who came from these very humble upbringings in South London. He was in the workhouse. His mother was in the asylum, was put into the asylum when separated from him when he was just 13 years old. And I think that upbringing never really left him. As soon as he invented this tramp character, he kept on returning to those streets of his youth, and he rebuilt them in his Hollywood studio when he made his way over there in the 1910s. And so this tramp character, who was so enwrapped up in his own personality, propelled him to unprecedented fame and fortune. I think before he stepped onto the cinema screen, no one had been famous in the way that Charlie Chaplin was. And he sort of lived his life through cinema. He kept on returning to those streets of his childhood. He kept on using films to kind of explore his fears and his past humiliations. And then later on, as he became more politically aware with films like Modern Times, he kind of made these great capitalist critiques and kind of satirized Hitler in The Great Dictator. But it's around this point that I think people's identification with him started to become questioned as his films became more vocally political. That's when the tide of public opinion started to become more complex towards him. And eventually in the early 1950s, he's kind of ejected from America, where he made his name. So it's an extraordinary life story, and one that takes in, some of the great works of cinema.
Mm. And I mean, for me watching it, I don't know how other people receive it, but kind of as you mentioned there, the figure of Charlie Chaplin, his outline, the name, of course, is instantly recognizable to me. But then I'm watching this film and all the clips, and I realized I don't know how much of his work I'd actually seen, and barely really knew any of the things that come up in the documentary. So was there something, in terms of the timing, of kind of allowing, today's generations or generations coming behind us to kind of know about this man, as well as pay tribute to to the man in terms of the people who would already be very familiar with him?
I think that's it. When we were first developing this film, we did a workshop quite early on with some school kids, and they must have been from ages sort of 8 to 14 years old. And we started by showing sort of images of the hat, the cane, the moustache, the boots, the sort of elements of Chaplin's costume, and it was striking to us just how many people in that room kind of recognized Chaplin, this sort of outline of him, of the tramp character, and yet, of course, that none of them in that room had seen any of his films. But there was just something about that character that is sort of imprinted on kind of cultural memory that is really quite unique. And so I think that we set out early on to try and explore that, to try and unpack that, to try and get beneath the sense of who that man was. But it was a journey for us as well. There is so much in Chaplin's life and so much sort of myth and mythology around him that James just spoke to, that really at times becomes quite kind of dizzying. And we start this film with the quote, which is enjoy any Charlie Chaplin you have the good fortune to encounter, but don't try and link them up. And so we like that sense of sort of of playfulness, really, that sort of puzzle of trying to kind of wade into that kind of messiness of Chaplin's biography. And so, yeah, we hope that there's stuff in the film that people weren't fully aware of. And of course, also, whilst exploring Chaplin's troubled character, his troubled upbringing, and of course, the sort of the scandals of his relationships with abusive relationships with women, and of course in the 1940s when he's driven out of America, somehow sort of both hold that and cradle that in the film, but also celebrate this great kind of legacy, this great artistic legacy that he left us.
And it is a big part of the film, I guess, kind of more in the first half, of just kind of delving into all this work that he produced. And it kind of really draws out how, even to a contemporary audience, like a lot of it, you know, still seems kind of quite fresh and innovative. Quite a lot of it is quite subversive. This idea that, you know, he kind of blended gender and, you know, wasn't afraid to kind of just go wherever his imagination took him. And also the fact that he kind of did channel a lot of his own traumas, you know, different elements of his life as his career went on into his art. So even to, you know, looking at that as, you know, a medium today actually hasn't aged, even though, you know, you're watching a silent black and white film. If you look at the substance of it, it's quite astounding. So was that also something that you really wanted to bring out?
Absolutely. I think that's so interesting. I think it very much reflected our journey of Chaplin. I think I watched I watched his films for the first time when I was about sort of 17. And I think, you know, Chaplin's come to become sort of emblematic of a very cartoonish idea of silent cinema, you know, of kind of films played at the wrong speed and sort of super slapstick. And that's partly, I think, because when talkies came along, there was a lot of work by Hollywood studios to try and discredit silent cinema. And also, I think Chaplin's films were so successful that often they became, films were reproduced. And so you'd watch these very awful prints where you could barely see him and that were played at the wrong speed, etc. And so I think our own response to him was very much finding, as you say, that that he's an artist who not only does his work feel incredibly fresh, partly through this just fantastic charm that he has on screen, and this ability he has to kind of, I think, break down your defenses when he looks out at you from the screen. You know, we talk about it a bit in the film. He's constantly breaking the fourth wall and kind of checking in with you as an audience in this very mischievous way, this flirtatious way, where it feels like he's kind of confiding with you as an audience member. But not just that, as you say, as soon as his work becomes longer, it sort of leaves the trappings of kind of one reeler comedies and two reeler comedies. He's instantly introducing pathos and kind of making, as you say, more personal works too. And then as they go on and they become increasingly political, his work keeps expanding. And it's interesting that when he builds this, you know, huge studio empire with armies of people at his disposal, even making sort of the first comedy epic in films like The Gold Rush, he's still returning to these personal themes of hunger, desperation, and poverty. You know, he uses the tramp costume as a way to journey inwards, really.
And of course, you know, I guess as documentarians, you know, it's important to provide balance, and you don't shy away from the kind of more troubling sides of him. You know, both the kind of became very tabloidy, but then also, you know, in terms of what, like, you know, his ex-wives had to say about how they were treated. So was that, you know, an important aspect? And, you know, how did you want that to come across? Because I feel that, you know, there's plenty of moments where you feel a lot of sympathy, you know, when you look at where he came from and his humble beginnings and how he, you know, it was his kind of, you know, rag to riches story. But how do we then ignore, you know, this other side of his character? So, you know, how did you want to kind of balance those things?
Yeah, I mean, structurally, it was a challenge. You know, I mean, broadly speaking, we kind of follow the chronology of his films and his life, I suppose. But there is a sort of a hinge point halfway through the film, which is when, as you say, we first sort of go into the story of Lita Grey, Chaplin's second wife, which was this huge kind of tabloid sensation that blew up. So she was a young actress who Chaplin became involved with, and then married her. And when they first got together, she was 16 and under 16.
Yeah, under 16,
sorry.
became,
And so it was a huge kind of scandal, even at the time. You know, people sort of people were remarking on it in the press and being quite desultory about her, calling her a gold digger and Chaplin's child bride and so forth. And so I think, like, for us, we knew that we had this. We wanted the audience to be very much on Chaplin's side when he's coming up, when he's growing up in Victorian London and he's escaping the kind of the poverty of his childhood, and it's very difficult not to fall in love with that character on screen, but yet there are these very troubling aspects of his biography. And so structurally it became a bit of a problem for us, but we realized that there was I guess we started, I suppose, realizing that as soon as we introduced that story about Lita, there would be that really the audience's sympathy would kind of be extinguished. So there was a bit of a balance of that. But Chaplin himself goes on to make the Modern Times, where he's sort of exploring the kind of the Great Depression, and then of course takes this great confrontation with Adolf Hitler. But all along, these troubling relationships with women seemed to percolate. And what became particularly interesting to us was in the 1940s, when a very similar story breaks again with the young actress Joan Barry. Chaplin at this point doesn't have the armor, the protection of the tramp and his wealth and his fame and celebrity, and so it becomes much harder for him to be able to brush off these scandals and elements of the press and Hoover's FBI sort of coalesce to try and bring him down, and of course it's only a few short years before Chaplin himself is forced to leave America there. So there's something very interesting in the way that sort of power and celebrity and the institutions of state kind of operating there that we found certainly fascinating in Chaplin's own life story, but also very much speaks to more kind of contemporary resonances, I suppose, experiences that Hollywood has been grappling with in the last sort of 10 years or so.
Yeah, and so what do you hope that people take away from watching it overall? Because it just felt like there were so many themes that came out that seem to really resonate today. Even that speech that he gives when dressed as Hitler in the Modern Dictator, that called? Felt like, if you kind of skipped some parts of it, someone could be giving that speech today. So and that idea of fame and kind of having to deal with sort of a dual personality, if you like, the real person behind the mask, and he kind of almost did wear a mask, even though it was, kind of makeup and a hairdo and everything. If you think of social media now, it's kind of like a similar thing going on. So, do you think there are lots of these themes that come out, and what do you hope people take away from watching it?
Yeah, well, I think you've really, for us, hit on one of the central sort of, I think, puzzles of the film, which is how we relate to people through technology, how we relate to people through screens, and as we've said, Chaplin is one of the first people in history who I think people were able to kind of forge a relationship with in that way, and so to see him kind of in a way being a pioneer in so many ways, in terms of both this experience of celebrity, but also in terms of being one of cinema's first auteurs, whose work was so personal and who kind of exerted creative control over every aspect of his productions. He, as well as starring in his films, he wrote, directed, edited, he even scored the music. So he was kind of he made cinema into a very personal art form, and that really sort of transcended the comedy that he started with, and he sort of lived his life through cinema, through this tramp character who was sort of this avatar, as you say, but also someone who allowed him to burrow inwards, and so yeah, we hope that for people who've never seen a Chaplin film, that it's an introduction to his work, and that people who know him well will find new treasures, because we found new things that have never been heard before that hopefully shed some new light on his character. And so yeah, we hope it's a journey for anyone, no matter where you come to it, no matter how you approach it. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm out of time, but it's been a pleasure to speak to you and to have all that insight. Actually, the thing that was funny, because I used to live in Elephant and Castle, and I remember that bar. I think it was closed, but I do remember the name and the figure. I think that's the bit they've torn down now. So I knew those bits.
Completely gone. It sort of closed down whilst we were making, when we first started making the film. Yeah, when we closed off all of the estate there.
Yeah, it's sad to see it go.
Yeah.
All right, but it's been lovely to chat to you. Thank you so much for your time. Can't wait for everyone else to see this incredible documentary. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, both.